Donald Trump and these groups have become fascist. Now, when you look at fascism, there are two elements to it that are as predictable as the sun rising in the east in the morning. One is the violence, and two is the anti-Semitism. Right? They are part and parcel of any right-wing fascistic movement. So in this country, where we've just had our 199th mass shooting in the last 128 days,
Wow.
the mass shooter who killed 8 in Texas, the most recent as of this podcast, had a patch on his tactical gear, and that patch was familiar because it was on the vests of the Proud Boy and the Oath Keeper leader, some of them, and it says RWDS. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the shooter at the really tragic incident in Allen, Texas, which took place on May the 7th, had a patch that we've been able to identify that said RWDS, which stands for Right Wing Death Squad, which is a phrase. It's not a real group per se, but a kind of association popular with right-wing extremists. Now, interestingly, Steve, we know that this individual, so immediately, he was killed on site, and the law enforcement immediately pulled down his social media feeds. My analysts at ADL have gotten our hands on much of his kind of digital footprints. So we're analyzing those breadcrumbs right now as we do this podcast. That being said, what's interesting is he was a Hispanic male, yet clearly parroting or somewhat sort of fascinated by right-wing, white supremacist extremist content. So it points out some of the, again, contradictions of this moment, because one of the features of Trumpism is you have people who are part of this MAGA movement who are from minority groups, who stand to lose if the MAGA movement gains traction. And some of its most prominent proponents, like Nick Fuentes, who, Donald Trump's dinner date, or Enrico Tarrio, who was just found guilty last week, could be sentenced as much as 20 years. He's the leader of the Proud Boys and was part of the Quarter of People, or he egged on the people to take the Capitol on January the 6th. He wasn't in Washington because he'd been arrested a few days earlier for burning a Black Lives Matter flag. But people like Tarrio and Fuentes and this guy, Latinos, like you would say, well, why are they a part of this movement? Because this kind of authoritarianism, this kind of white nationalism defies some of the conventional ways that we think about it. Just because you're Hispanic doesn't mean you can't propound xenophobic racism that could affect Hispanic people. I see Jewish people who are part of the MAGA movement that I think has deep anti-Semitism to it. And I see other Jewish people who are anti-Zionist, which again is a deeply anti-Semitic thing. So sometimes these forms of hate don't snap neatly into the boxes that we think about them in. It's just more complicated.
When you think about the tenuousness of America's political system right now, the level of anger that there seems to be, the level of boiling extremism, the intimations of violence, members that routinely cross into anti-Semitic rhetoric, whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene, whether it's Paul Gosar. How do you approach a political party at its leadership level, talking to them about their craziest members?
Very hard. And it's a very interesting question, Steve, because it didn't used to be this way. So say 10 years ago, every party, let me step back. Extremism is not a partisan phenomenon. Neither side of the political spectrum is exempt from intolerance. You see it manifest over time, lots of ways. You get haters on both sides. You might not know it if you only watch certain cable news networks, but it happens on all sides. And yet, what's happened recently is, again, with this hyper partisanship, people are now unwilling to acknowledge those who offend when they're within their own ranks. And so take someone like Paul Gosar, who is a member of the House delegation from Arizona, who is awful, who openly associates with white supremacists, who openly associates with anti-Semites. Honestly, like, you can't make it up. And yet, for some reason, whereas in an earlier time, the Republican Party and its leadership in the House shut out the haters. Like, what was his name from, escapes me for a moment.
David Duke?
No, that's a good example. So when David Duke ran for Senate in Louisiana, George H.W. Bush immediately said, he's a racist, we want nothing to do with him, and shut him out from any support from the GOP. Literally. And when he won the primary. And then I'm thinking about the guy in Iowa, the longstanding House member, his name just escapes me, unfortunately, but Kevin McCarthy, when he was the minority leader, stripped him of his committee assignments about 4 years ago. Steve King of blessed memory. You know, like, literally, Kevin McCarthy kneecapped him. Now today, he's got people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's an open Christian nationalist, and to say that she says offensive things is a massive understatement. Paul Gosar, who openly associates with the anti-Semites and Nazis, sitting by his side. It boggles the mind. Now, again, you see it on the Democratic side too, where, again, I mentioned Rashida Tlaib. She is a hardcore, unrepentant anti-Zionist who uses every opportunity she can to slander the state of Israel, despite the fact that we know that that kind of slander leads to anti-Semitism here in the United States. Doesn't matter. She's got an intersectional worldview that ends where Israel begins. And so she literally propounds that every problem in the world is a function of the only Jewish state on the planet. So I share this both because there's, at an earlier time, Rashida Tlaib and Paul Gosar would not be embraced by their leadership, but that seems to happen now. And it makes it much harder for a group like mine when we go to a leader Jeffries or Speaker McCarthy to get the kind of basic results we would expect, where people who espouse radical views, instead of being pushed to the sidelines, are welcomed into the center, into the forefront of the politics. It's a crazy sign of these crazy times.